scholar in the social networks and health literature. She routinely does the intro session on analyzing ego network data for social networks and health, and just blows us all away. And so it's really a great that she was able to join us again today. And take a step away from, I think they roped you into being an administrator in your off time. And so I'm glad that we're able to at least bring you back to science for a moment. So Brea, I'm going to turn the screen over to you. You should have full control if you want it. So
great. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. So I don't have big plans for this session. It was originally supposed to be, I think, sort of a Q&A. And so I thought that maybe this would be a good experience if you don't have questions about the video. So maybe we could start there. What questions do you have about the video, if any? And then if, barring that, if no one wants to pipe up, then I would be happy to just answer any questions about your own research in the sort of ego network universe. A lot of people want to run their specific case by me and want advice about whether they should be collecting sociocentric or ego network data, or what are the best name generators to use. And sometimes when I do those kinds of sessions in my summer courses, those are the, among the best learning opportunities for people, because they're seeing the sort of theories and methods applied to real world examples. So maybe we could start with, questions related to the video. And then if you guys are quiet, we can move on to any other question. Do you want to know whether I like dogs or cats? I could answer that. Really, whatever you guys want. If you want professional advice, I may not have good advice, but I'll give it to you. So really, I'm yours for the next 30 minutes. Use me for whatever you want. So maybe we'll start with any questions about the video or about the information in the video. It took me 3 tries to make that video. Very proud of that. Because I told Jim, I think it's because it's like my penance for getting out of teaching during the pandemic. And everyone else knows how to do this now, and I did not, and now I do. So
now we do. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, whatever. I learned something.
We did have an attendee ask via email ahead of time for if you were going to talk about multi-level modeling of egocentric data. And if you want to say something generally about that, that could be a start.
Sure. I mean, I wasn't planning. I've talked about that. That's what I talk about sort of in the other session.
Which we directed people to. For
you all. Yeah. Yeah, it's super fun. I think it's a really underutilized way to analyze these kinds of data. And as long as your dependent variable is something at the alter or tie level, it's really fun to do. You can also get a lot more power. So, we've used it pretty strategically in studies where, say we only have 200 egos, but those egos each have on average 8 or 10 alters. If I'm predicting something at the alter level, then wow, I have a lot more power than if I'm aggregating everything to the ego level. So I do it all the time. I love doing it. If you have specific questions about it, I would be more than happy to answer those. But yeah, it's possible and it's really fun. What's really fun is like cross-level interactions, right? Like, is something happening at the alter level dependent on something at the network level? That's really cool. I like that. So those are fun to do. But yeah, I'm not sure what else to say without more direction.
Allison, please.
Okay, so I wanted to take you up on a name generator question, and I'm relatively new to network analysis. So in my survey, we do a bunch of different name generators, like who do you rely on for health information, emotional support. Mm-hmm. And so say my outcome is a health outcome. Do I just use the name generator for who do you rely on for health, or am I combining these name generator questions? Because maybe your emotional support network, maybe that's who you actually turn to for health behaviors.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important and interesting question. So what I would do is I would start by trying to really understand where the health support networks are coming from. So do you see correlation with, you know, specifically people that they said they talked to about health or help them with health? Are you seeing them coming from other name generators? That to me is a really interesting question, just right there, right? An interesting empirical question. Where are health supporters coming from in your network? And so that's where I would start. And that should also then tell you, if you're trying to predict that kind of support, who should you include? Who should you aggregate together? And, you know, in addition to being sort of data driven, I think it's also always good practice to think about what would the potential mechanism be, because networks are really messy and they're correlated with a lot of stuff at the individual level. So you want to make sure that you have a pretty strong social mechanism in mind when you're thinking about linking those, right? And this is like relates to some of the research we published on functional specificity, right? Like, what do important matters have to do with getting a job? There may be a link there, right? Not exactly clear what it is, right? So, you know, the more that you can sort of dial down to what's actually happening in that interaction, the better. So it's really great that you specifically asked for health supporters or health matters networks, however you did it. It's great that you did that. But yeah, I think you're right. It doesn't necessarily mean that other people in the network would be providing help, because, you know, as Mario Small and others have talked about, sometimes you turn to whoever happens to be there, right? And if you have a lot of people there that are highly supportive, then maybe those people are also important. But just try to have a mechanism in mind. Otherwise, you know, you might find relationships that are really due to some confounding factor at the individual level. So I think, especially in sort of the network research realm of things, and maybe even especially the ego network realm, like, you should have some idea of a mechanism going into it, right? Instead of doing a bunch of data mining. Hopefully that was helpful.
And they get warm people up. We have a handful of questions in the chat. Somebody want to read them? One of our guys?
Sure. Unless somebody who wrote the question wants to, unless, you know, Ruslan, do you want to read your own question, or should I read it? You're welcome to. Maybe I'll just go ahead. So, do we know much about the relationship between personality traits and social network characteristics in relation to health and behavior outcomes? Is the first question.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think there is quite a bit of research on sort of the big 5 personality traits and how those are related to sort of the structure or function of networks in general. I don't know much about specifically related to health, although I did publish a paper that I think is super interesting and no one ever cites it or knows it exists. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. But
Well, yeah, give us the site for that. Put it in the chat at one point.
Oh, I'll have to find it. I'll find it. But yeah, so basically we looked at, oh shit, what's the name of the trait? It's basically like, hold on. Sorry, this is probably the problem, is that I don't remember anything that I ever published ever. It's in Social Science and Medicine. Called Contributions of Personality to something. Sorry.
Look for it if you want to keep going.
Like extroversion, neuroticism.
No. Okay, so basically the trait is, oh, here we go. Contributions of personality to social influence, contingent associations between network, body size, composition, and BMI. Okay, so there's this trait. Oh, it's self-monitoring. Yeah. Okay, so we found that self-monitoring, which is this trait where, you know, you're constantly sort of evaluating your behavior and whether it lines up with social norms. We found that moderates the association between the sort of push of social influence and outcomes and behavior, right? So social influence, in other words, may not have the same effect on everyone. That could actually depend on your personality. So, you know, you could be someone that has a bunch of smokers in your network. And if you're a low self-monitor, right? In other words, you don't really care what other people in your network are doing or what they think, then it's going to have a much smaller effect on your smoking uptake than it would somebody who's really more prone to being influenced by others. So I think that's super interesting because we do see heterogeneity in the effects of social influence, right? And we're often trying to explain, like, what is it? And typically as network researchers, we want to look to features of the relationship or to features of the structure of the network, but it might actually be something about that person's individual personality, you know, and whether they like giving a flying fart about what other people think or not. That's not a very technical way to describe low self-monitors, but that's basically what it boils down to. So I know of that one. And then I'm sure if there was any other related research, we would have reviewed it and cited it in that paper. So that might be sort of a good place to start in terms of, you know, your fingers out into the literature. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot, but with respect to health, I mean, you could argue that, you know, like people who are extroverts and who are sensation seekers tend to have larger networks and be more sort of socially engaged. There's some interesting research linking personality traits to your social signatures. So sort of like how you tend to organize your social interactions, what's your sort of set point for network size or for number of social interactions you want to have. And that research is really interesting. And of course, that has implications for health. But, you know, you probably, if you're wanting to write a paper about that, you might have to start with, you know, you might have to start with the sort of preliminary linkage of personality to networks, you know, and then draw conclusions about networks and health. Or there might be some huge literature and I just am not familiar with that, but that's what I know.
Thank you, very helpful.
Yeah.
And I guess my second question is, how do we effectively visualize egocentric networks in papers?
Yeah, so it's really hard, right? Because what you end up with, I mean, network people, we all love to look at pictures of networks. I don't know what there's like something in our brains where we're like, I want to look at a big fuzz ball and try to read something in these tea leaves. This is like common to all of us. And so as egocentric researchers, it's kind of hard sometimes, you know, to know how you can do that. And so I use visualizations a lot, but you know, with ego research, you essentially have like a galaxy of networks, right? Like little constellations of networks. And I think I even put a figure like that in the video. So the way that I principally use them is as ideal types. So I will look at relationships between things like, you know, size, density, or effective size, things like, you know, number of kin in the network or gender of the network. And I look at, on average, what's the relationship between those characteristics and some outcome. And then I'll present ideal types using like predicted probabilities. So like, let me see, I can probably show you one. My files are such a mess, you guys. Let's see.
As prep, well, Bria's looking for that. As prep for this, Gabe put together a nice little tutorial on some of the, granted, very limited tools in R for doing ego network visualization. We'll post that to the webpage, the training webpage as well.
Let's see. Okay, here we go. I got it. It's a miracle. I'll share my screen. Hold on. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see that. So this is an example of how I routinely use them. So these are, you know, we're doing research on the relationship between social networks and cognitive reserve, which is, you know, basically the idea in layperson's terms that your brain can be like a total mess, but you may or may not have dementia in terms of your cognitive outcomes, because some people's brains just sort of work around the pathology. And we think that that's related to social networks over the life course and sort of access to novel social stimuli. So here, you know, you can see these are sort of what networks look like on average So I say, I just literally run frequency distributions across these are normal cognition, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. And so it shows just really quickly, here's what networks look like on average for these three groups. So, I mean, that's one way to use them. It's also really like if you all write grants or anything, oh my God, grant reviewers love to see these. They like these pictures too, as it turns out. And it's just really like an easy way to, look and sort of convey some pattern in your data visually. Amar Dond does this really well. So he's an ego network researcher that studies stroke. And he has several publications with just like these beautiful sort of illustrations. And so he uses them also to show sort of not necessarily based on his own data, but sort of this is what this ideal network would look like if you want to like get to the hospital super quick after a stroke, right? And this is what, and this is why. And then he, sort of uses it to like go through the theory or the mechanism that leads, A to B, and it's really effective. So yeah, I'll stop talking about that now, unless people have other direct questions about it.
Thank you.
I'll type his name in the.
I
Could
think
be
this is-
spelling it wrong because that is not my forte, but.
You want to keep reading the questions, Gabe?
Sure, I can keep going. So another question, can you kindly talk a little bit more about the egocentric tergum and how do you feel about the usage and limit of such an approach?
Yeah, so I don't use them at all. And this is in part because, ergums are really about like, are these two people, like, is there a tie between these people, right? And why is that happening? Usually it's not that I don't think they're useful for some things. It's just that I'm typically focused on ego's outcomes. And so they're just not always as useful, right? It's just not always the right tool for the job. I also hate learning new things. So, I think if I have to be motivated. So I'm not going to like seek out to use these models just because they exist. Some people are like that. They're really motivated by like learning new tricks. That is not me. I am motivated by some research question or some theory. And if I have to learn the tool in order to answer that question, then I will. But if I don't, then I'm not going to. So that's really all I have to say about that. Sorry. What else? What else you got for me?
Faye, if you're welcome if you have a response to that to speak up as well.
Do you mind? So the reason why I ask is because I want to try to use the egocentric tergum in one of the research. I just find there are only like limited number of packages and like limited number of publications here. So any input will be great from this perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would love to be able to give you input, but because I have not myself used them, I can't really say much. I mean, I know there are a lot of sort of areas of networks where people have attempted to, make the leap from things that are popular or that work really well in sociocentric networks, and then they try to like find a solution or apply it to ego networks. And it just doesn't get as much subscription, it seems like. So in general, I find that with ego network methods that aren't conventional, there just seems to be less resources out there. Yeah. And maybe it's because it's actually like kind of a forced fit in some cases. Or maybe it's because, I don't know, people are fine with the normal methods.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, yeah, I can't be very helpful, unfortunately.
Thank you so much.
I'm sure they're great. I just don't really use them.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
All right.
We have about just for time we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna move on to the next question. Keith had a question. Would you like to say it yourself, or should I read it?
I can read it. And I'll give a quick background. I've been doing work on social networks and substance abuse for some years, and all of my networks have been in prison settings where I could say logically that people are isolated in these programs and nobody questions me. It's probably not true, but nobody questions it. And now I'm moving into community group homes. And so everybody is in the group home is actually required to go to a 12-step or some other self-help group. They have therapists. It's a very different situation, much more open. So my question is, how do we integrate, and what are the methodologies for integrating ego nets, which is the sort of thing I would think people will give me from the self-help groups. So I'm not going to have access to all the self-help groups. And residential-based full networks.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going to have residential full networks, and they're also going to go to these groups. And sometimes they might encounter the same people in those groups and even potentially be linked in those groups.
Yeah, that's actually true, but they'll probably encounter a bunch of different people in those groups too.
Got you. Okay. So you're going to have a situation basically where you have ego networks that are potentially overlapping.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So just to start at like a really high level, Steve Morgatti has now convinced me that ego networks and sociocentric networks are actually not really super different things. It's really more of a continuum, right? And you can collect data in an egocentric way or in a sociocentric way, right? Sort of what's your assumption when you start. And you can also analyze either kind of data in either way, right? So there's really not that much of a difference between them. It's more of like sort of a continuum. So the idea that you would, you could potentially sample egos, right? And then ask about their ego networks and then connect those networks later if you have a way of doing that, either because you know their names, you may not be able to get that through IRB given what you study. There's some software for probabilistically matching. And then what I kind of tell people is ideally for most of the methods that I use, so HLM, or just even regular regression, you want your ego networks to be independent, ideally, right? Like you want there to be very little overlap, if any. You want egos to be completely independent. That's just not true in the real world. And so there are lots of real world cases where there is going to be some overlap, and you can't always quantify what that overlap is. I think it's less dangerous. There is no like hard and fast, right? It's less dangerous if you're in the realm of aggregating everything to the ego level, because even if there is like a shared alter or a shared connection or a connection between ego and alter, because you're aggregating amongst like lots of other ties in the network, then it's probably not as big of a deal. You could still continue to treat those egos as independent of each other. But if you get into a situation where like they're in the same residential home, then yeah, it's going to be too much overlapping. You need to treat it as sociocentric. One thing you could potentially do is, I'm thinking about your specific situation, is you could potentially think about, rather than linking through shared alters or ego alter ties, do you know what these groups are? And could you use those as another level in an HLM, right? So for example, maybe you have two egos. You don't actually know whether they have shared alters for sure, because you're not allowed to match them via IRB, but you know they both attend Alcoholics Anonymous on Tuesday nights at this church, right? Then you can use that to try to adjust for the lack of independence, rather than dealing with it by trying to understand which ties are shared. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
That might be enough.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, we have a question. Benjamin had a question. The question is, I am wondering when it may be useful to randomly sample from the alter list, i.e. ask for a large number of alters and then make a random selection of 10 alters to obtain alter characteristics and alter ties. It helps with respondent burden, but there are gross pitfalls.
Yeah, so we are sort of dealing with this right now because we're doing a study where someone yesterday named 47 alters.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, and so they spent 3 hours just doing the network part of the survey, and that's only one part. And in general, I don't think you should limit the number of alters people should name, especially if it's smaller networks. But yeah, that's not tenable, right? So I have read up a little bit on this random sampling, and there don't seem to be too many disadvantages. But if I was going to do it, I think it's going to be most problematic when you're doing alter level analyses. So like when you want to use MLM to predict something about an alter. If you're aggregating to the ego level, then random sampling should be fine, right? Because in theory, you've sampled randomly and the mean should be pretty similar, right? But of course, you'll have to use some, figure out sort of what the margin of error is on either side of that. But in general, I think if you're aggregating, it's probably fine. If you care about specific alters, it could be more problematic because you could be missing somebody that's really key to understanding sort of whatever social process you're interested in. If that's the case, then I would consider who are the most important people that you don't want to miss, right? So I definitely want to ask about their spouse or partner. I definitely want to ask about, say, their kids, right? Or who knows? I mean, it could be in a totally different context, but, or maybe if you're in a work context, I definitely want to ask about their supervisor and the people that they work with on a daily basis. And then everybody else you could set up as random, right? Like who else do you get work advice from or something, right? Like then maybe if it's sort of potentially outside like those absolutely key people that you may want to be able to like predict what they're doing in their relationship, then you could use random sampling from some of the network. That's how I would approach it. I've never done it, but that's probably what I would do. And I think people have done it and it seems to go fine. But again, I just always worry about like, are you going to miss that one alter that's like, super important. You could also do it for just for alter ties, which I think is, potentially less problematic in terms of predicting things at the alter level, because you're not going to predict an alter tie at the alter level. And that's where you really get that exponential growth in how much you have to ask in respondent burden with number of ties. Or you could, if you're doing a much larger survey, you could ask like a couple of things that you really want everybody to answer. And then the rest could be random assignment or something. So I guess I would say I would take a measured approach, right? Like depending on what it is you really care about. You don't want to miss anything if you're going to the trouble to do this study. But it's a balance, right? Like it's always a balance. And when in doubt, be driven by your social mechanism, right? Be driven by your research questions. Always, always, always. That's sort of the go-to. Is my time up?
Your time is close. There's a couple more questions. Do you have stomach to sit through them?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we'll move to the next question. Is it important to center data at the ego level when comparing outcomes across ego network? Asks Avi.
What do you mean by that exactly? Do you mean like when you're doing LM?
Yeah, so to give you a real world example, I asked people with kidney disease, who's in your network, who in your network offered to donate you a kidney. And what I found is there's people who you have strong ties with, and then there's people you have weak ties with as measured by relationship strength. And then I'm interested, well, who is more likely to go and get tested? Is it your strong ties or your weak ties? And so there's a couple of things. First of all, do I, maybe my idea of a strong tie is different than your idea of a strong tie because, using it, like, for example, using a 10-point scale, do I center it on, take the sum of the, do I center it on all my relationships within my ego network and see how far you differ from it? Or can I just compare a 10 in my ego network would be the same as a 10 in your ego network?
Yeah, okay, now I understand. Yeah. So I think it completely depends about whether, again, what's your research question? Is this a within network analysis or a between network analysis? Right. So in other words, are you asking whether who am I, who's going to get tested in my network compared to other people in my network? Or are you interested in sort of on average, who, egos with this kind of network, are they more likely to have people get tested than egos with another kind of network, right? If it's the former, then you want to center. If it's the latter, then it doesn't really matter.
Could I have like a slight part two of that question? Now, what about, for example, I asked alter ties and I look at the density. And then, the weak ties are less densely connected, but then that's also dependent on the ego network density. What would you recommend there?
So I think that, so density, you're not going to be able to center by ego, right? Because it's at the ego level.
Right.
So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking.
So so for example, I calculated how densely the alter is interconnected within the ego network.
Oh, I see. So you have like alter, yeah, like, okay, I see, like alter centrality or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So then it would be the same thing. Yeah. If you could do a within network type analysis of the ties.
I see.
Yeah. I mean, you could also just look at strength of tie controlling for density, and that's going to get you part of the way there too. So there are a couple strategies. If you want to send me your models, I'd be happy to look at them.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. There's another. Do you know of anything about Stata that you would recommend people to use for ego networks?
I hate R. I only did the workshop in R because Jim made me do it. I love Stata. Oh my God. So I actually have a Stata do file that I'm not sure I completely debugged it. Like some of the things just may not work, but it should get you most of the way there in terms of calculating all the aggregated ego measures that you would want. And it's just a do file. And it's kind of generic, like you could just plug in your own variables. So if anybody wants that, I would be happy to send it, as long as you don't hold me accountable if something goes horribly wrong.
And you have to promise to cite that paper that she says no one reads. So work that into whatever you've done.
Yeah.
Bria, as always, it's just a joy and a pleasure to hear you think. I really appreciate you doing that for us here. It's about time for us to wrap up Bria's session. So we're running a little bit long already. So I just want to say thank you. And we'll take a 5-minute break and come up and wrap things up. So.
All right, my pleasure. Nice to see you all. Thanks for your
Good to see you, Bria. Thanks for doing this. Stay safe.
Yep, bye.
All right, folks, let's come back at, let's give ourselves, like 3 minutes to, just stand up and take the creaks out of our backs, and we'll come back at, what is it now, 3:14. Let's come back at, let's take 5 minutes, or let's come back at 3:20. So you actually give yourself 5 minutes, and we will then just do a wrap up or anything anybody wants.